Born July 18, 1918, Nelson Mandela was born into the Madiba clan in the village of Mavizo, Transkei.
At the age of 12, Nelson Mandela's father passed away. Taken to his elders, he listened to their stories of his ancestors during the wars of resistance.
These stories inspired Nelson Mandela to make his own contribution to the freedom struggle of his people.
The Land Act passed June 19, 1913, began the territorial segregation of black South Africans and white South Africans.
The Land Act restricted ownership of the land for the majority of the black South African population. Majority of the land was reserved for the whites or Europeans. Just 7% of the agricultural land was set aside for the blacks or Africans, even though they made up 67% of the population.
These reserves became the homelands in which different tribal groups were forcibly settled.
His involvement pertaining to the law began in college, where he attended Fort Hare, from which he was then later sent home for participating in boycotts against university policies.
After his studies, he began working with the ANC, also known as the African National Congress, which fought to reduce racial tension in South Africa.
In 1948, the Apartheid began. Tensions grew, and with Nelson Mandela on the African National Congress's side as their executive committee officer, they fought to end all of the racial measures that were put in place by apartheid laws.
The Defiance Campaign of 1952 was a time when 10,000 people rallied to defy the laws to protest the oppressive measures of the apartheid.
In 1956, Nelson Mandela, along with 150 other colleagues, were put on trial for various activities regarding the Defiance Campaign. This trial was dragged on for over 5 years, which they were later acquitted for in 1961.
On March 21, 1960, 5,000 to 7,000 black African protesters gathered in the town of Sharpeville. They marched to the police station where the police shot at the crowd, killing 69 people, leading to an uproar known as the Sharpeville Massacre.
Demonstrations against the South African government's strict apartheid policies flare into shocking violence. At Sharpeville, an industrial township, thousands gather outside a police station in protest against new laws requiring every African to carry a pass at all times. The crowd refused to disperse and began stoning the police, who opened fire into the crowd from behind a wire fence. In 2 days of demonstrations that began here, between 50 and 100 were killed and hundreds injured. Worldwide protests were raised, including a condemnation of the violence by the United States State Department. In South Africa, a mass work boycott by Africans is crippling industry in the area. An uneasy calm reigns. The conditions that led to the Sharpeville tragedy continue unchanged.
Shortly after the killings in Sharpeville, Nelson Mandela co-founded a new armed wing of the ANC. This new addition was known as the Spear of the Nation. Mandela believed that the armed wing was needed because the peaceful demands of protests were only met by force from the government and protection was deemed necessary.
People feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people.
3 years later, in 1963, Nelson Mandela, along with 8 other ANC members, were put on trial for committing sabotage against the South African apartheid government. Mandela was sentenced 27 years to life, in which he would serve at Robben Island along with his violent underground ANC members.
While in prison, Nelson Mandela received his Bachelor of Law degree from the University of London. He also was a mentor to other prisoners, encouraging them to seek treatment through nonviolent resistance. Although Nelson Mandela was forced from the spotlight, he remained the symbolic leader of the anti-apartheid movement. In only a matter of time, the world began to take notice. The shootings of 29 black students in the town of Soweto triggered the attention of the world.
In southern Africa, yet another outbreak of violent protest in the black townships around Johannesburg has
added to the violence which has caused 29 deaths so far.
For the violence and killing which overtook a number of black townships.
There was no way
one could turn away from the struggle in South Africa during that time because so much was happening and it was in the face. You couldn't ignore it.
Apartheid is as evil, as immoral, as unchristian in my view as Nazism. And in my view, the Reagan administration's support and collaboration with it is equally immoral, evil, and totally unchristian.
An international boycott began to take place against South Africa to push for racial equality and for companies to make the decision of what's morally right. Nations all over the world boycotted against large global companies who made profits off of South Africa. People a part of stock shares, universities, cities, and states pressured these global companies. Soon companies began to declare their discontinuation with South Africa.
I have to be honest about this, a clear business reason. The country was becoming, quote, unbankable. And I wanted out.
Not only were companies boycotted, but sports were also boycotted. As another way to push for racial equality in South Africa, they were eliminated from playing rugby in the 1970 Olympics.
If you really want to hurt them, you stop them playing rugby.
I had a little baby nervous breakdown, from all the trauma that we were experiencing.
You just had to say, sorry, guys, the game is up. That was what they understood, and they had to respond to that.
In 1980, a new campaign was formed, the Free Nelson Mandela campaign, turning Nelson Mandela into a household name. As protests continued and pressure mounted, the government offered to free Mandela, but in exchange for various political compromises.
In 1989, newly elected President F.W. de Klerk lifted the ban on the ANC and ordered Mandela's release on February 11, 1990.
Nelson Mandela picked up his work with the ANC and continued negotiating with political organizations for the end of the apartheid.
Tension did not cease to exist in South Africa, but Nelson Mandela and F.W. de Klerk continued to fight against apartheid, which earned them the Nobel Peace Prize in December 1993.
On April 22, 1994, an outstanding 22 million South Africans turned out to cast ballots in which would be the first multiracial parliamentary election in the history of South Africa.
On May 10, 1994, the country had spoken. They chose the ANC to lead their country with Nelson Mandela as their leader, making him the first black president of South Africa, and with F.W. de Klerk serving as his first deputy.
As president, Nelson Mandela introduced several economic and social programs geared towards the black South African population. He also worked on the enactment of a new constitution. This new constitution established a strong central government based on the majority rule and prohibited discrimination.
Nelson Mandela stepped down as ANC leader and president in 1997. Nelson Mandela passed away at the age of 95, December 5, 2013.
Nelson Mandela's wisdom, courage, and willingness to sacrifice for others allowed Nelson Mandela to lead a nation to freedom. His biggest triumph was the lessons he learned and the path he repeatedly chose to walk.